Courting Conflict with Russia by Patrick Buchanan. He who wants to defend everything defends nothing, and he who wants to be everyone's friend has no friends in the end. Frederick the Great. The price of empire is America's soul, and that price is too high. J. William Fulbright. The Cold War was an exceptional time that called forth exceptional commitments. A nation that had wanted to stay out of World War II had declared by 1950 that an attack on Turkey would be treated as an attack on Tennessee, and that the 38th parallel of Korea would be defended as though it were the 49th parallel of the United States. But when the Cold War ended, the Cold War coalition collapsed, and traditionalists declared the time had come to dissolve the now unnecessary alliances and bring the boys home. Shocked at this outbreak of isolationism, internationalists quickly pressed America to seize the moment to begin an era of benevolent global hegemony. The Wolfowitz Memorandum. The Republican establishment was first to advance this vision. Its hand was tipped in early 1992 in a secret Pentagon memorandum leaked to the New York Times. Prepared under the direction of Undersecretary Paul Wolfowitz, the 46-page memo was described by the Washington Post as a classified blueprint intended to help set the nation's direction for the next century. The document, wrote reporter Barton Gellman, casts Russia as the gravest political threat to U.S. vital interests and presumes the United States would spearhead a NATO counterattack if Russia launched an invasion of Lithuania. That Baltic Republic had now become a U.S. vital interest. But how could the United States save Lithuania from Russia? Wrote Gellman, the Pentagon contemplates a major war by land, sea, and air in which 24 NATO divisions, 70 fighter squadrons, and 6 aircraft carrier battle groups would keep the Russian Navy bottled up in the eastern Baltic, bomb supply lines in Russia, and use armored formations to expel Russian forces from Lithuania. The authors state that Russia is unlikely to respond with nuclear weapons, but they provide no basis for that assessment. What made this scenario so astonishing was that only a year earlier George Bush barely protested when Mikhail Gorbachev ordered Spetsnaz troops into Vilnius. Just 3 weeks before the leak, Bush and President Boris Yeltsin had issued a joint declaration that Russia and the United States do not regard each other as potential adversaries. The Wolfowitz memo also envisioned U.S. war guarantees to Eastern Europe and permanent U.S. involvement on every continent. America's dominance was to remain so great as to deter potential competitors from even aspiring to a larger regional or global role. Preventing the emergence of rival superpowers was now declared a dominant consideration underlying the new regional defense strategy and requiring that we endeavor to prevent any hostile power from dominating a region whose resources would, under consolidated control, be sufficient to generate global power. These regions include Western Europe, East Asia, the territory of the former Soviet Union, and Southwest Asia. The Pentagon had decided the United States would never permit any nation, Russia, Germany, China, Japan, to rise again even to the status of regional superpower. To maintain global hegemony, the Pentagon anticipated U.S. military intervention for promoting ends far beyond the protection of vital interests. As the Washington Post noted, while the U.S. cannot become the world's policeman by assuming responsibility for righting every wrong, we will retain the preeminent responsibility for addressing selectively those wrongs which threaten not only our interests, but those of our allies or friends, or which could seriously unsettle international relations. Containment, a defensive strategy, had given way to a breathtakingly ambitious offensive strategy to establish and protect a new order. Reaction was sharp. Ex-Secretary of Defense Harold Brown warned that extending war guarantees to Eastern Europe would provoke Russian nationalism, risking the same grave danger of nuclear war that prevented intervention there for 45 years. Senator Joseph Biden ridiculed the memo as a formula for a Pax Americana. Senator Edward Kennedy said the Pentagon plans appear to be aimed primarily at finding new ways to justify Cold War levels of military spending. The Wolfowitz Plan seemed to have been laughed off the table. But by the end of the 1990s, crucial elements had been adopted by Congress and President Clinton, and passively accepted by the American people. By 1998, the administration, with Biden and Kennedy's support, had indeed extended NATO to Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, and had offered membership to the Baltic states. Thus, NATO expansion is the first site at which to explore the new fault line in American foreign policy. The hegemonist vision. America's hegemonists argue the case for NATO expansion by citing justice, history, and the national interest. This, they say, is America's hour. The eagle triumphant should spread its protective wings over liberated Eastern Europe to shield it from Russian revanchism and lock it onto a democratic path. To have left Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic outside of NATO, they argue, would have reenacted the betrayal of the Czechs at Munich, of the Poles at Yalta, of the Hungarians in 1956. In the phrase of Václav Havel, to deny the nations of Eastern Europe membership in NATO would have invited the return of the Munich danger. Indeed, we owe these people who suffered so under Hitler and Stalin. The geostrategic argument is that the three new members of NATO are the eastern buffer states of Germany. To leave them outside the West security zone is to invite the Russian bear to go prowling again. A larger NATO will make us safer, says Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, by expanding the area in Europe where wars simply do not happen. By putting Moscow on notice that Eastern Europe is now part of the West, we strengthen the alliance and ensure that the bear keeps its claws off. The argument from history runs thus. Conflicts in Europe often erupt into general wars, and the United States is inevitably dragged in to protect vital interests. Far better for America to put its weight in the balance before these wars begin. If history teaches us anything, writes Senator Richard Lugar, it is that the United States is always drawn into such European conflicts because our vital interests are ultimately engaged. Rebuttals from history. Yet, history teaches no such thing. Between 1789 and 1914, there were 7 major European wars. The Wars of the French Republic, 1792 to 1802, Napoleon's Wars, 1803 to 1815, the Crimean War, 1853 to 1855, the War of Piedmont and France against Austria, 1859 to 1860, the Austro-Prussian War, 1866, the Franco-Prussian War, 1870 to 1871, and the Balkan Wars, 1912 and 1913. With the exceptions of an undeclared naval war with France under John Adams and the War of 1812, the United States stayed out of them all. As for World Wars I and II, the United States kept clear of both conflicts for more than 2 years before going in. For 2 consecutive decades between the beheading of Louis XVI and Napoleon's invasion of Russia, Europe fought, yet America was neutral. Madison took us in 1812 only because the opportunity to grab Canada, with the Iron Duke preoccupied, proved irresistible. As for World War I, Wilson could have responded to U-boat attacks on U.S. merchant ships in 1917 with a naval war, without sending a single soldier to France. As late as December 1916, the President professed to see no difference in the war aims of the Allies and the Central Powers, and no compelling U.S. interest to justify intervention. In 1939, the United States anticipated that Britain and France would block any Nazi drive into Western Europe. When France was overrun, the United States rushed to aid Britain. By the fall of 1940, Hitler was contained at the Channel. By December 1941, he had been halted outside Leningrad and Moscow. U.S. policy was succeeding without one American ground soldier in combat. People forget the United States did not declare war on Germany until after Hitler declared war on the United States on December 11, 1941. FDR's "date which will live in infamy" speech did not even mention Germany. After World War II, America sent troops back to Europe to prevent it from being overrun by the Red Army. But Dwight Eisenhower pledged that the troops would remain only 10 years. True to his word, in 1961, Ike urged John F. Kennedy to begin bringing the troops home. Writes Kennedy biographer Richard Reeves, Eisenhower told his successor that it was time to start bringing the troops home from Europe. America is carrying far more than her share of the free world defense, he said. It was time for the other nations of NATO to take on more of the costs of their own defense. Their economies were more productive than ever in their histories, and the costs of American deployment were creating a trade imbalance, draining gold from the United States Treasury. Kennedy nodded, but he ignored Eisenhower's advice. Had Ike's counsel been heeded, America would have removed Europe's crutches and forced the Allies to walk on their own feet again. The most successful alliance in history thus failed by the standards of its founders. Half a century later, Europe remains a U.S. military dependency. Why did U.S. troops have to return to Europe? Because in 1943, at Casablanca, Franklin D. Roosevelt had foolishly declared America's war aim to be the unconditional surrender of Germany. That meant the Red Army would be in Berlin at war's end, and Germany could not play its historical role of keeping Russia out of Europe. That role would have to be assumed, as it was, by the United States. NATO, as a temporary alliance against the Soviet Empire that had declared the United States to be its main enemy, was consistent with the tradition of George Washington. But expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe, where no president had ever asserted a vital interest and no U.S. Army had ever fought, is an absolute break with Washington's great rule. Our foreign policy elite is making commitments previous generations could not have conceived of, ignoring the warnings of wiser men, including columnist and liberal internationalist Walter Lippmann, who wrote, when America was at the peak of its power, "Our power is on the sea and in the air, not on the land, and our interest in the interior of the European continent is indirect. To encourage the nations of Central and Eastern Europe to organize themselves as a barrier against Russia would be to make a commitment that the United States could not carry out." NATO expansionists insist that America must defend Europe in perpetuity because Europe's wars always put the U.S. economy at risk. History has taught us, writes Anthony Lake, Clinton's former national security advisor, that when Europe is in turmoil, America suffers, and when Europe is peaceful and prosperous, America can thrive as well. But again, history teaches no such thing. During the Napoleonic Wars, America, cut off from trade by its own embargoes, became a more self-sufficient nation, World War I pulled us out of the recession of 1913 and 1914. World War II brought an end to the Depression. In every great European war, a neutral America prospered. Comes the counter-argument. Perhaps that was true yesterday, but today we are immersed in a global economy. When Russia, the Pacific Rim, or Europe fails, we will fail. No nation is an island. No nation can stand alone. Economic interdependence and military interdependence are one and the same. The answer to that argument, rather than squander American wealth propping up failed foreign economies or spilling the blood of America's young in foreign wars, let us restore the political, economic, and military independence that was the dream and purpose of Washington, Hamilton, Madison, Clay, and the Republican Party from Lincoln to World War II. The democratist temptation. Liberal internationalists contend that NATO's expansion into Eastern Europe will fix these nations forever in the democratic camp. But when did the kind of regime other nations adopt become a vital interest of the United States? NATO's founding fathers had no qualms about negotiating base agreements with Spain's General Franco. They also brought in Portugal, though ruled by a dictator, Dr. Salazar, whose successor would prove more reliable than Europe's democracies during the Yom Kippur War. Inclusion in NATO did not prevent Greece from succumbing to the dictatorship of the colonels from 1967 to 1974, or Turkey from passing repeatedly under military rule. That democracy is putting down roots in Eastern Europe is welcome news. But democracy was not introduced to Warsaw, Prague, Budapest, or the Baltic republics by NATO. It sprang up before NATO membership was at issue. The nation America most needs to lock onto a democratic path is Russia. Yet, by making allies of countries once part of its empire, we treat Russia as the Allies treated Germany at Versailles, rubbing its nose in its defeat, pushing it outside the Western enclosure, virtually designating Russia a permanent enemy. To capture a pawn, we are risking a queen. The U.S. posture toward other nations should be based not on their internal arrangements, but on their stance toward us. After June 22, 1941, Stalin's Soviet Union was no longer Hitler's partner, but our ally. After victory in 1945, Stalin reverted to his natural hostility to America. China, an ally against Japan, was our enemy in Korea. Just as policies change and regimes pass, so too should alliances be temporary and transient. Whether a nation is democratic should be of less concern to us than how it views America. In the Cold War, autocratic Pakistan was a better friend than democratic India, which sided with Moscow in the Afghan War. Chile's Pinochet was a better friend than the elected demagogue Salvador Allende. The authoritarians in Seoul and Manila supported America in Vietnam, while France and Britain traded with the enemy, and Europe's socialists denounced what Reagan called a noble cause as a dirty and immoral war. When we say a nation is democratic, we say only that its leaders reflect the will of its people. Would America be better off with regimes in Morocco, Algeria, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait that better reflected the will of the Arab street? Is that a cause worth crusading for, fighting for, dying for? Of the Persian Gulf nations, perhaps the most democratic, if voter approval and popular support are our yardstick, is Iran. The form of government nations adopt is their own business, and a foreign policy that declares global democracy as its goal is arrogant and utopian. Governments evolve out of a nation's history, culture, religious heritage, and traditions. Like alcoholics, democracies backslide. But the rise of autocrats does not threaten us if we decline to make the internal affairs of other nations our central concern. While West Germany underwent years of denazification before being brought into NATO, no nation in Eastern Europe has undertaken a purge of communist officials. NATO's newest members are democratic, but authoritarian elements from the communist era still control the military, the intelligence agencies, and the educational system. War plans shared with these allies are likely to be weekend reading in Moscow. Breaking faith with Russia. By pushing a U.S. alliance up to Russia's borders, we are violating solemn pledges given when Moscow agreed to German reunification. U.S. leaders say we never gave any written reassurances, but Gorbachev could never have brought the Red Army home had Russia's military believed its bases would be occupied by NATO troops. Regarding a high-level meeting in Moscow in which German Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher and Secretary of State James Baker participated, Susan Eisenhower, a scholar on Russia, writes, Genscher promoted a no expansion of NATO concept, an idea that Baker, too, had advanced. It was at the February meeting that the key words were spoken, words that are still a source of debate. If a unified Germany was anchored in NATO, Secretary Baker said to Gorbachev, NATO's jurisdiction or forces would not move eastward. Apparently, Gorbachev was receptive to that assurance and emphasized that any expansion of the zone of NATO is unacceptable. I agree, Baker said. Heartened by Baker's comments, several months later, in May, Gorbachev gave up his idea that Germany must remain neutral, or at least a member of both blocs. He conceded, without consulting his advisers, that the German people should be able to choose the alliance they wished to join. Against that background, writes Eisenhower, it is not surprising that NATO expansion has been viewed with great hostility across the entire Russian political spectrum. Adds scholar Stanley Kober, Russians are now experiencing a sense of betrayal because they apparently were promised, when Germany was reunited, that there would be no further expansion of NATO. In the words of former Russian Prime Minister Yevgeny Primakov, in conversations with Mikhail Gorbachev, Eduard Shevardnadze, and Dmitry Yazov, held in 1990 to 1991, i.e., when the West was vitally interested in the Soviet troop withdrawal from the German Democratic Republic and wanted us to swallow the bitter pill, the disintegration of the Warsaw Treaty Organization, François Mitterrand, John Major, and James Baker, all of them said one and the same thing. NATO will not move to the east by a single inch, and not a single Warsaw Pact country will be admitted to NATO. This was exactly what they said. These conversations were not codified in the form of official documents at that time. Former Soviet ambassador to Britain, Anatoly Adamyshin, contends that when Moscow let the Berlin Wall come down and began to withdraw its troops from Eastern Europe, we were given repeated assurances that NATO would not expand an inch eastwards. John Matlock, the U.S. ambassador to Russia in 1990, confirms that Gorbachev had reason to believe that he had been given a blanket promise that NATO would not expand. In the early 1990s, the romance of the age was between America and a Russia liberated from Leninism. Reagan was being toasted in Moscow for having been right about the evil empire. Boris Yeltsin was being toasted in America for having stood atop a tank and defied communists attempting to reestablish the ancient regime. How far away that all seems. An agitated Russia, believing America is taking advantage of Russia's present weakness to humiliate the nation, has sacked its pro-U.S. foreign minister, named an ex-KGB chief to be prime minister, refused to ratify the START II arms treaty, moved closer to Beijing, funneled weapons into the Caucasus to destabilize pro-U.S. regimes, sold weapons and nuclear technology to Iran, and sided with Saddam Hussein. The most fateful error of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era, says George F. Kennan, of the expansion of NATO. Russia is today a bankrupt, demoralized nation whose presidency is lusted after by Democrats, demagogues, ex-generals, and communists, with a single conviction in common. All believe NATO expansion to be a provocation, an example of American bad faith in exploiting Russian weakness. Russian military analyst Pavel Felgenhauer warns that public opinion is changing. NATO expansion will turn a whole generation of Russians anti-American. We soothingly reassure Moscow that NATO's expansion is benign. But if the Russians gave war guarantees to Mexico and began arming and training Mexican troops, would any Russian assurance diminish our determination to run them out of our hemisphere? If rising resentment in Russia leads to Yeltsin's replacement with an anti-American nationalist, full blame must rest squarely with a haughty U.S. elite that has done its best to humiliate Russia. Why are we doing this? This is not 1948. Stalin is dead. The Soviet Empire is dead. The Soviet Union is dead. European Russia is smaller than the Russia of Peter the Great. Between the vital interests of our two nations, there is no conflict. But these proud people retain thousands of nuclear weapons. A friendly Russia is far more critical to U.S. security than any alliance with Warsaw or Prague. If the United States has one overriding national security interest in the new century, it is to avoid collisions with great nuclear powers like Russia. By moving NATO onto Russia's front porch, we have scheduled a 21st century confrontation. Europe's sick man of today is going to get well. When Russia does, it will proclaim its own Monroe Doctrine. And when that day comes, America will face a hellish dilemma. Risk confrontation with a nuclear-armed Russia, determined to recreate its old sphere of influence, or renege on solemn commitments and see NATO collapse. Are we really willing to use nuclear weapons to defend Eastern Europe? For that is what NATO membership means. And if we make good on the commitment of Clinton and Madeleine Albright to bring in the Baltic republics, it is impossible to see how these tiny nations can be defended, short of an escalation to a nuclear crisis similar to Cuba in 1962. From alliance to protectorate. By expanding NATO to Eastern Europe, the United States has changed the character of the alliance from a defensive pact to an American protectorate. Europe knows this, and every ally has thus cut back on defense. After a NATO conference in Madrid in 1997, France declared it would contribute nothing to expansion. The Clinton administration claims NATO expansion will cost us only $1.5 billion over 10 years. Whom are we deceiving? Does anyone believe a U.S. protectorate over Eastern Europe can be bought for less than the price of a B-2 bomber? As Europeans slash budgets to maintain deficit targets demanded by the European Monetary Union, a crisis over who pays for NATO expansion looms. We claim this is being done for Europe's protection. Europe sees it as a scheme for permanent U.S. hegemony and has decided that if the Americans want to play Romans, let Americans pay the costs and take the risks. What America has in Europe today are less allies than dependencies, and the brave Polish people would be well advised not to rely too heavily on guarantees that, in the event of any attack, NATO will declare war and send troops to its rescue. Surely the Poles remember 1939. This generation has forgotten its own history. 5 presidents were confronted with Soviet outrages in Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Reagan. Not one used force. Can anyone believe Clinton or Gore would go to Congress for a declaration of war if Polish and Russian soldiers clashed? Clinton has already said we will not move nuclear weapons or any significant number of troops into Poland, which should tell us all we need to know about this administration's resolve. That Poland is independent and democratic is among the great peace dividends of our Cold War victory, but Poland has never been a vital U.S. interest. For the first 130 years of our existence, Poland did not exist as an independent nation. Its partition by Nazis and Stalinists did not even convince FDR to abandon neutrality. Its incorporation into the Soviet Empire was virtually acceded to by FDR at Tehran. To assert that Poland's democracy and frontiers are now matters over which we will fight a nuclear war is, in David Lloyd George's phrase about British guarantees to Poland in 1939, demented, the most reckless commitment any country has ever entered into. There is an element of fecklessness and immorality in a policy that persuades nations to rely on guarantees we can no more honor than Britain could honor its guarantees to Poland. General Eisenhower commanded the greatest American army in history, but even he halted before Berlin, Vienna, and Prague. Today's U.S. Army is 1/10 the size of the American Army of 1945, yet the United States has now declared it will not only defend and rescue Prague, Warsaw, and Budapest, it is also ready to give the same solemn commitment to Vilnius, Riga, and Tallinn. If America pushes to bring the Baltic states into NATO, Britain and Germany will not go along. Thus, Clinton and Albright have scheduled a diplomatic collision in which NATO will face 3 options. 1. The Allies will buckle to U.S. demands and bring the Baltic republics in, enraging Moscow. 2. The United States will use Europe's opposition as grounds for backing away from its commitments to the Baltic states, which will be declared a second Yalta. Or 3. The United States will issue unilateral guarantees, creating a crisis in U.S.-Russian relations. With defense a smaller share of the budget and gross domestic product than at the time of Pearl Harbor, the only way the United States could force Russia to disgorge Polish or Baltic territory would be with airstrikes, a blockade, and the threat of nuclear weapons. But as the Russians have put the West on notice that the diminished size of their army and navy means early reliance on the use of nuclear weapons in any future war, is this wise? Russia may be destitute and weak, but should a nationalist regime take power, rebuild the army, impose Moscow's will on the Baltic states, and menace Poland, the United States will have to call up the reserves, reinstitute the draft, and be ready to impose a blockade and conduct air and missile strikes on Russian armed forces, risking atomic retribution. Let us pray Russia never tests the U.S. NATO commitment to go to war for Poland. A bridge too far. Lost in the enthusiasm to include the liberated nations of Europe in NATO is the fact that NATO is not a social club, it is a military alliance. Under Article 5, the heart of the treaty, an armed attack against one NATO nation is to be considered an armed attack on all. Before 1949, America had never entered such an alliance. Whether we should have was hotly debated, but the guarantees were given. After Mao Zedong's armies overran China and South Korea was invaded, NATO was extended to Greece and Turkey. But the nation was assured that NATO's red line was at the Elbe. When Soviet tanks returned to Budapest in 1956 and to Prague in 1968, neither Eisenhower nor Johnson threatened military action. Yet, without a national debate, the United States has now moved its red line to Russia's border. Should Russian troops in the Kaliningrad enclave between Poland and Lithuania skirmish with Polish troops, America could be at war. Do we realize that? Should Belarus, ruled by an admirer of Hitler, clash with Poland, the 82nd Airborne could be on the way, F-16s could be making airstrikes on Minsk, and Washington and Moscow could be careening toward confrontation. Are Americans aware of this? Is a nation that did not want to send peacekeeping troops to Bosnia willing to send combat troops to Bialystok? Historically, nations enter alliances to strengthen themselves. How is America strengthened by an alliance with the Czech Republic? How do we respond if Moscow demands a corridor through Lithuania to Kaliningrad, where more Russian troops are stationed than there are U.S. troops in all of Europe? What do we do if Moscow decides to move its own defense line west by putting troops back in the Baltic republics? Where are those 24 NATO divisions of the Wolfowitz Memo going to come from? Since the Gulf War, we have cut defense to 3% of GDP, from 6% in the Reagan years, and mustered 550,000 people out of our armed forces, a reduction in force equal to the army of Desert Storm. Yet triumphalism is pandemic. The Washington Post declares it is now our duty to set about ensuring that no country, by virtue of size or history, can determine another's fate. This is hubris of the kind that got Marines massacred in Beirut, where they had no more business than do U.S. Army troops on the Belarusian border. Offering NATO memberships to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and, as some urge, Ukraine, is rashness bordering on madness. This would put the Russian base at Kaliningrad behind NATO lines and bring into a U.S.-led alliance 3 nations with huge Russian minorities. Latvia is half Russian, eastern Ukraine almost entirely Russian. America could neither defend nor liberate these nations without the risk of nuclear war. America's lost opportunity. Consider again the opportunity America had in 1991. Moscow had let its empire collapse, pulled the Red Army back inside its borders, and allowed Germany to be reunited. The Baltic republics and Ukraine had been set free. And now, having overthrown communism, Russia stretched out its hand to America. Every goal of our Cold War policy had been achieved. Yet, instead of behaving toward Russia as we did toward Germany and Japan after World War II, we began treating Russia like a dangerous delinquent and probable recidivist, to be corralled and contained in the tight little box where history had put it. In 1997, U.S. Marines conducted exercises in the Crimea. U.S. paratroops jumped into Kazakhstan, and U.S. strategists sought to cut Moscow out of the oil trade of the Caucasus. The imperious attitude seems to be, if the Russians don't like it, tough. What can they do about it? Given the balance of power, Russia can only seethe. But the present balance will not endure forever. Like Weimar Germany, Russia is seeking friends where it can find them. In Tehran, Minsk, Belgrade, Baghdad, Beijing. In February 1998, Georgian leader Eduard Shevardnadze was the target of assassins. Suspected motive: to disrupt U.S.-backed plans to move Caspian Sea oil through an Azerbaijani-Georgian pipeline to the Black Sea, cutting Russia out. In Armenia, a pro-Western president was ousted, and Russian arms began pouring in. The believed objective: to destabilize the region, block the pipeline. Even more ominous, Moscow has been berating Riga for maltreatment of its Russian minority. Latvia has 600,000 Russians, many of them retirees of the Red Army and Soviet Navy. Yet America plans to bring Latvia into NATO. What the future holds. Why the rush to expand NATO? Asked the New York Times. Answer: handing out NATO memberships like White House souvenirs has produced popularity for U.S. politicians. Warsaw, Prague, and Budapest are delighted, but Moscow seethes and Belarus grows belligerent. Tension is greatest in the Baltic and Ukraine, where the U.S.-Russian crisis is likely to come. Never has so extravagant a commitment been made. We have put the world on notice that the Americans are never coming home, that our duty is henceforth and forever to defend virtually every border in Europe. NATO expansionists have won the day, but they have scheduled a series of clashes that will mean a humiliating backdown by either Russia or the United States, or war. We have committed American children yet unborn to fight Russians yet unborn over land no president ever considered vital. This hubristic attempt to impose a U.S. protectorate over Europe will one day be challenged. That day, we will awaken to find that a new generation is not willing to send its sons to fight in places they have never heard of, simply because this generation pledged they would go. NATO expansion is a rash and provocative act, unrelated to our true security interests and rooted in an ignorance of American history and traditions. Our hegemonists are confident that America's power is too great for any to resist. History teaches otherwise. Every attempt to establish hegemony incites resentment and hostility. Weaker nations instinctively seek security in each other, creating the very combinations the hegemonists most fear. It is a law of history. The thesis calls into being the antithesis. The weak collude to balance off the strong. U.S. assurances that its hegemony is benevolent only confirm the suspicion of those it is intended to constrict and circumscribe. 15 years after Britain established hegemony over North America, Americans were fighting alongside their old French enemies to overthrow it. Allied hegemony in Europe in 1919 persuaded Germany to make common cause with Bolsheviks, whose agents they had just liquidated. Lenin and Stalin were happy to accommodate at Rapallo. Hitler's conquest of France, our buffer state on the Atlantic, aroused America to take Iceland, send aid to Britain, and begin hunting German submarines. Stalin's hegemony over Central Europe called into being the NATO alliance. When the Soviet Union was in its ascendancy, Nixon, foremost anti-communist of his generation, went to Beijing to embrace Mao. Even anti-communists applauded, for they believed Nixon was trying to balance off the power of the greater threat to the United States. America's hegemonists have already begun to reap the predictable results. China and Russia, the two nations capable of doing mortal damage to us, have formed a strategic partnership to oppose U.S. hegemony. If we are to remain a republic, each generation should decide when and whether to risk the life of the nation and the lives of its young. We ought not to be foreclosing future generations' options or making their decisions. As Jefferson said, "The earth belongs to the living, not to the dead." This essay is a chapter in Buchanan's book, A Republic, Not an Empire, published in 1999.